I'm very excited to show you this next feature of Cubot V3. The Crosshatch fill tool is an amazing and powerful tool for machine quilters to add a level of depth and interest to your quilt. Crosshatch fills are a technique that quilters use on quilts for hundreds of years, actually. Probably one of the very first things that was quilted with a crosshatch, because if you were doing it by hand, it was probably easier to stitch a straight line and then stitch another straight line at an angle to it, and then you can cover a broad area and get a nice texture to otherwise flat piece of fabric. And that was maybe 200 years ago, or even earlier. And now with long arm machines, and we do machine quilting, long armers use rulers. And it's called ruler work. They put a ruler onto the bed of the machine, and then they draw the head across the ruler and draw straight lines at differing intersecting angles to fill areas and add a lot of texture to the quilt. And it's a nice blend of taking something that's traditional and pulling it into the machine quilting world. Well, with Cubot V3, we now have a feature under our fill quilting tab that allows us to do automatic cross hatching. And like other features in V3, it is very intuitive. It is also very precise, and the results are amazing, which are our three catchphrases for Cubot V3. So let's get to it. I've got a nice little panel that I have on my frame back here. And what we can do is, and it also has a neat little element inside of it, like that we'll pretend it's an applique. So we're going to crosshatch this area, but knock out the center area, which is our applique, so to speak, and show you the power of the crosshatch fill that we have in Cubot V3. So let's get started. First, let's look at the revised screen here on Cubot. This is our home screen, and you see the button Fill Quilting right here. Let's press Fill Quilting. Well, actually, let's check this button out first. Let's check out that Quilting Options button. We have quilting options for the crosshatch pattern defaults. Now, these defaults look at the spacing, the rotation angle, and the intersecting angle of the crosshatch. And these are just defaults. And if you look at my screen, I have my spacing set to 0.375 or 3/8 of an inch. I have my direction set to 45 degrees, and I have my intersection angle set at 90. These are just defaults. When we do the actual cross hatching and we're in the modify section for the cross hatching routine, we can alter all of that stuff. So this is just a broad brush. When we first fill an area, what do we put in it? And these are what those defaults mean. Now, after doing several different designs over the course of testing the crosshatch feature, I've come in on 3/8 of an inch, 45 degrees, and 90 degrees for the intersection angle. Your values will probably be different. These are just my values. So let's go back to the main screen, and we will choose Fill Quilting. Now, it's a very familiar screen, what we see here. It's asking us to choose our quilting area, and there's actually two parts to this. It's not just the outer area. We will choose the outer area first, but then we can choose inner areas as well to knock out sections that would be around applique or other quilting designs. Now, on my panel here, if we take a look at my panel, I have this center section here, which is gold and yellow. That's where we're going to be doing the cross hatching. And we have these ornament shapes that are strung together, and I'm going to treat those as an applique. So we're going to knock out that area around all of those ornaments and all of this detail work here. We're going to knock that out and not cross hatch through that. Now, this is a pretty extreme example, and when I go through and I select my points around that applique, you'll notice that I'm selecting hundreds of points. And I'll fast forward through that section. You'll see the points show up on the screen, and they'll come up really fast, but I'm taking my time to outline those pretend appliques to be very precise. I want to show you the precision that we have with Qbot in the video as well. So let's go first. We're going to determine our outside area, or outside boundary, and I will zoom in here on my needle cam a little bit so you can see where I'm choosing. I'm just going to choose the outer boundary, and I will go through and set a bunch of points with this as well, because no straight line on a quilt is ever straight. So I move, I'm going about 3/4 of an inch or so between points here. I want to do a good job. I'm not going to throw this sample away. I'm going to use this sample as a wall hanging. So I will just go through this. Okay, I've finished selecting the outer boundary, so I press done. And check this out. We have a new box here. This is a box that we see in fill quilting only, and it says select inner boundary shape. Do you want to set an inner boundary shape? We do. So let's say yes. So when I press yes, you can see that there's some grid that shows up in there. That's a filler crosshatch pattern. It doesn't really mean anything at this point at all. And I'm going to look at my area here, and I'm going to start and end my, let's see, where's the best place to start and end? I think it's right here, because here we have two ornaments that intersect, and I think if I start at this point here and then end at this point here, I can select this area in one section. Now I'm also going to choose this area very carefully, because it's filled with curves and lots of detail. And in some spots my boundary points are only going to be probably a stitch length from each other. I'm going to select these boundary points as if I were making nodes of a design. Actually, I'm going to do this very precisely. And the key here is that we have an option later to stitch the outer and inner boundaries. Well, I'm not going to stitch the outer boundary because I've already done line quilting and stitched in the ditch to make that outer boundary. I already have a line of stitching there, so I don't need to redo that. I don't want to have it heavy with a lot of lines on top of each other. Now on the inner boundary, I am going to stitch it. So when I stitch the inner boundary, that's going to be basically outlining the design on this print, or it's like outlining the applique. So I want to choose those points very carefully. If I chose point, point, point and was very blocky, it's going to stitch a straight line in between those boundary points, and the result isn't going to look so nice. So I'm going to take my time and choose these points very nicely. So right now I've chosen 304 of the nodes for the inner boundary, and I'm not done yet. So I probably have another 300 nodes. I'm being very particular about this for this video, and I just want to show the precision when we quilt it out. But probably most of you won't be choosing this many nodes when going around an applique, but it's good to know that you can. Okay, so I finished up selecting my points. And get back to my regular glasses there. So I finished up selecting my points, and I am ready to press done. So I press done, and I do not want to set another inner boundary shape. I'm frankly a little bit worn out. That took me 25 minutes or so to set that boundary shape so precisely, but I think it's going to pay off. So do you want to set an inner boundary shape? No. And there it has automatically cross-hatched using my defaults. It has automatically cross-hatched the area, but I want to make some modifications to it, and that way I'll show you how easy it is. Following the same rules of Cubot V3, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. One finger, gesturing on top of the design area, one finger swiping left will lower the distance between the lines down to 0.010 of an inch, which is basically a thread width. So if you wanted to do a small area and basically blanket it with stitching, you would go all the way down and it will be a solid level of stitches. That's going to be way too tight for this, of course. So what I'm going to do is, and I've done some measurements, and I think I would like the look of about 3/4 of an inch to maybe an inch spacing on this. So I'm going to probably end up right around there. So one finger changes the spacing. Two fingers, thumb and forefinger, change the rotation angle of the design. And three fingers sets the intersection angle. So let's go over here and look at the screen. So one finger, I'm going to move to the right, and you can see it gets bigger. And you know, looking at it, looking how everything, there's 1 inch, and that will probably look pretty good. But I'll go just a little bit smaller, maybe to 0.875. So what you can see there is that we have one finger gesturing, and that's a rough estimate. We also have the plus and minus keys for spacing. So if I hit the plus, it increments it up and down. And then finally, if you tap the yellow square, you can do a direct input. So we maintain the methodology that we use in the modify routine and throughout V3. We have 3 methods to change something. So gesture method is one method. Second method is using the nudging keys. And then the third method is a direct input of the number. So let's look at direction angle. So right now I've got, I'm going to use 2 fingers and I'm going to rotate the design. So there I'm rotating the design, just using 2 fingers and rotating it about. And on this quilt here, because it's got a boundary that is basically squares that are on point, I think I want to stick with a 45 degree rotation for my rotation angle. And because they were squares, I'm going to stick with my 90 degree intersection angle. But let's take a look at how that can change. So let's do a direct input here, 45 degrees, that's okay. And now I'm going to use 3 fingers. So my thumb, forefinger, and middle finger, 3 fingers, and I'm going to play with the intersection angle. So there I've made a diamond, and then I'm going to use my 2 fingers, and I'm going to rotate that diamond pattern. So it's just that easy. 1, 2, 3 is in the 3-finger intersection angle. Once you change the intersection angle, then you probably have to change the rotation angle to get things aligned the way you want. And if you look at this here, you can see my intersection angle is 55.4 degrees and my direction angle is 32 degrees. And I bet you if I change that angle to 30 degrees and my intersection angle to 60 degrees, that'll look more like a perfect diamond shape, and it is aligned, it's aligned nicely. Now, one thing I notice here is that I kind of like the diamond shape as well, because it kind of matches a little bit nicer to the interior of the ornament shape. But I'm going to stick with my original thought, and I'm going to change my direction angle back to 45. And I'm going to stick to my intersection angle of 90 degrees. And I'm going to go with that. And my spacing is at 7/8 of an inch, 0.875. There are two more options. We can stitch the outer boundary by pressing that button, and we can stitch the inner boundary as well. But like I said before, I already have stitched the outer boundary on this quilt. I did that as part of line quilting to just kind of do in the ditch stitching prior to this to get this set up. So I'm going to say no, I'm going to uncheck the stitch outer boundary, but I am going to stitch the inner boundary. I press done. And then we can save this pattern, modify it, go back to the modify screen, remove it, or move to start. Now, when saving a crosshatch pattern, you can do it. There's no problem in doing it. But what would you use that for in the future? Don't know. I could say that if you stitch the inner boundary and stitch the outer boundary and then save that pattern, you might have something where you do, in a quilt block, you do something around an applique. And if you save that and then your next block is an open block that has just no piecing or anything in it, you might want to put that in there to keep the stitching the same and use the negative space and all of that kind of stuff. It might be something neat. You can save the pattern if you'd like. I'm not going to save the pattern here because I have nothing else to stitch on this little table runner. I'm going to now press move to the start. I'll move my machine a little bit closer to the start point though, which is shown by the green dot. I'll press move to start. Pull up my bobbin thread. And make sure my top thread is going through the foot so I don't get tangled up there. And then I press go. Now I've got tie-off stitching turned on. And there we see it automatically cross-hatching this area. Now once it gets to the inner boundary, it's going to stitch all the way around the inner boundary. And I'm glad I chose my points nicely, because what I'm seeing is that it's following the inner boundary really nicely and really highlighting that better than if I had tried to do this freehand for sure. There was no way I could get this level of detail if I tried to do this freehand. And now that it has done the inner boundary, the way it works, or the way the algorithm works, is it will start the crosshatch, and as soon as, if you have sew inner boundary turned on, as soon as it hits the boundary, inner or outer, it will sew the boundary and then continue with the crosshatch. So right now it's just going to continue with this crosshatch. So this is going, and one thing you do have to watch out for when you crosshatch, like I was saying before, is the sides and ends puckering in as you add layers and layers of stitching. One thing that we do within the Cubot V3 algorithm, however, is we never overstitch on the interior of the crosshatch, but we will overstitch around the boundaries. That way the boundaries, which are typically in piecing, the overstitching gets hidden in those a little bit better than if we overstitched in the interior where you would for sure see it. So I'm going to be paying attention to this. I want this to come out very nice as a sample. So I'm going to be paying attention to this to make sure all of my my entries into the crosshatch into the border look nice. And like that one looks really good. This interior one looks good. The batting I'm using has a little bit of extra loft to really make this punch as a sample. So I want to take care to make sure that this comes out nice. All right, so there you have it. There is cross-hatching in a nutshell. It is a very powerful tool in Cubot V3 for you to use. What I've shown here in this video is a very complicated example of going around a very detailed pattern or very detailed applique. I expect that most uses for the cross-hatching in V3 will be for filling areas that are just mainly fills, and fills with a simpler applique design without so many details within the design. But it's always there for you to use. Just some general recommendations to make your quilting life easier is to just remember a couple of things. One, if you do a very dense crosshatch, know that the fabric is going to ease in a little bit because of all those stitches. And two, quilt the outer boundary or inner boundary sparingly. Definitely use it if you need it. If you are going to be looking at the back of the quilt, keep that in mind. So if you are doing a crosshatch in a block that is going up against the seams, and you choose not to stitch in the ditch, and you choose not to stitch the boundary when you crosshatch, if it goes up into those areas, if this is the seam, if it goes into those seams, goes in at an angle, goes up a little bit, and then comes back at an angle, that on the front of the quilt, that little transition is going to be buried in the seam allowance. However, on the back of the quilt, which is just plain and flat, you're going to see something going into a point and then turning direction and going back out, and it may look odd. So think of the back of the quilt as well. If it's a really busy print on the back and you have matching thread that kind of just gets lost and you're not worried about it, no biggie. But if you have a very light fabric and you want to be able to flip that quilt over and see all of the quilting on the back as well, you may want to do those borders as well. So that's it. Enjoy the crosshatch feature in V3, and until the next feature, happy quilting.